Good morning, world. I'm Steve Rao, the host of Pod TV's World Edition, soon to be a part of the Roku TV network. Live from the All America city of Morrisville in North Carolina, the eighth largest state in the United States of America. In our World Edition, we bring you news from around the world, talk about innovation, and continue our discussion of what we can do to continue to navigate through a very dark and uncertain time in our country and the world. Today, we have a very special guest, but I want to begin my monologue before I bring him on. And that is, we are celebrating the life and legacy of the late Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King, who inspired a nation and world with one of the greatest speeches ever given for the fight for freedom and equality at his March for Washington speech, where he shared his vision of a dream. Normally, we gather at breakfasts or interfaith prayers in person, remembering his inspiring words, looking at the progress that Black Americans have made in our nation, including the election of the first Black president, Barack Obama. Today, there's a different tone in the air, a division the likes of which we've never seen, a struggle for voting rights, and the King family even saying today should not be a day of celebration, but a day of action. What does the dream mean today in America? What can others in the world learn about Dr. King's dream of equality, of justice? Are we moving a step backward in America, or are we moving forward? And what can we all do to make sure that the dream of equality and freedom rings true for every American at a time when we are more divided and polarized than we've ever been? And is our democracy in danger? Today with us, we have a very special guest for our global audience, a man who is the son of Floyd McKissick Sr., one of the great civil rights leaders in our nation, who fought alongside Dr. King. His son is with us today, Floyd McKissick Jr. Floyd McKissick Jr. is a leader in North Carolina of tremendous stature. He was a Durham City Councilman. Then he went on to serve with distinction in the North Carolina Senate, where he fought for many North Carolinians on many issues. Today, he is on the board of Utilities Commission. He's exploring a potential run for the United States Congress. We don't know what his plans are. And he is really involved with some of the issues I laid out. So we're going to bring him on very briefly. We're having some technical difficulties, so I've sent him some of the questions. We want to welcome my dear friend, Senator McKissick, here to say a few words with us, and then we're going to bring in our panel in a few minutes if we can make it work. Welcome, Floyd, to our World Edition.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's a pleasure to be with you this morning. Always enjoy sharing time with you on occasions like this and so many others.
Fantastic. Well, we know we're having some issues, so whatever you can do to hear me, I'm just going to ask you a little bit about your father for the audience. Today is a special edition. You have 20 minutes with us. We want to be just real quickly about your father, his life, what he would think of what's going on today, his influence on you, and then we'll dive right into the dream and just sort of you knew Dr. King as a young boy, and you've seen this evolve over time. So just talk to us a little bit about what you're feeling today.
Sure. Well, of course, my father was very instrumental in the civil rights movement. He was one of the leaders of the 5 major civil rights groups back in the 60s. The group that he led was called CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. They had basically about 240 plus chapters in about 42 states. At the time, they were probably the second largest civil rights organization in America. NAACP was always by several fold. But he worked closely with Dr. King on many occasions. They spoke at many rallies together. They worked together on numerous issues. CORE was very active and involved in the sit-ins Sometimes we think about the sit-ins occurring at A&T State University in February 1960. In fact, CORE was involved in sit-ins going as far back as the 1940s up in the state of Illinois. They were also instrumental in the freedom rides that we have read about and heard about, where you had multiracial groups getting onto buses, Greyhound buses, Trailway buses, going into South, and at a time where those types of accommodations were segregated in the South, and when those people got off of those buses, they were frequently beaten by law enforcement officers, and so I mean, CORE is instrumental involved in those activities. My father was among the 10 leaders that spoke at the March on Washington the day that King gave his very famous "I Have a Dream" speech, and a very articulate speech that symbolized and embodied, I think, the aspirations of all of us that were involved in the civil rights movement in that era. But King was a great leader, extraordinarily articulate, brought great passion to the cause, and someone who I marched with on many occasions when there were rallies or demonstrations or issues, and alongside my father in that time frame. I think today my father would be very disappointed by the divisiveness that's occurring in this country, particularly what occurred during the Trump administration, where you had a person who wasn't trying to pull our country together as a commander in chief. He was really trying to tear us apart. It was bitter, it was divisive, and it's very sad. And by what occurred last year on January 6th, we had this Stop the Steal movement that was coming to Washington. The very people talking about stopping the steal were the very ones there trying to steal an election and undo the lawful outcome of a Democratic vote from all 50 states. So, I mean, when you think about that, I'm sure my father would be extraordinarily disappointed. He'd be disappointed by all of the efforts that have been made by legislatures across our country, particularly those ones that are Republican dominated and controlled legislatures, to put barriers to allowing people to vote and to cast their votes. I think that he would be disappointed by the fact the Voting Rights Act in Section 5 is no longer with us as a result of Supreme Court decision. I think he would be one of those in favor of the Freedom to Vote Act, to make Election Day a national holiday, to restore the pre-clearance provisions of Section 5, allowing voter registration, same-day voter registration in all 50 states. And those are some of the things that the Freedom to Vote Act does, including, allowing felons who have finished their sentence, since they're out of jail, they've paid their debt to society, to allow them to be reinstated in terms of voting privilege and likewise getting rid of this partisan gerrymandering. It needs to take place at the legislature level and also the congressional level, right. But the Freedom to Vote Act would make it illegal when it comes to congressional redistricting, this extreme partisan gerrymandering. So I think he would be very much in favor of all that, and somebody who was a great friend and ally to John Lewis, who was the leader of SNCC back in the 1960s. And I would remind you that SNCC was started in North Carolina on the campus of Shaw University back in 1960 with the efforts of Ella Baker.
Fantastic. We're going to have our panelists come in a minute, but that's a great segue into my second question. So please, if you can hear me, or you can just go right to what we sent you. You talked about voting rights, the John Lewis Act. You've been a senator when in North Carolina you were with the majority party, working with a Democratic governor. You've been in the minority party. Based on what you said, I can assume that you believe this, but do you believe that our democracy is in danger? And when the Kings ask for a day of action, what should we be doing so that we can address some of these issues about voting rights and things like that?
Well, I think that, the King family's articulation of a day of action, I think, is necessary, is critical, and it's imperative. It's wonderful to have a day of service and to remember Dr. King and his legacy, but a day of action, in my mind, means starting that day. It doesn't end that day, but we need to be out there building the political infrastructure that's going to be necessary to make certain that good people get elected to office in our country, in all 50 states, and that's something we have to do. Right now, efforts are being made to undermine legitimate democratic Democratic votes. When I say Democratic votes, not for a Democratic candidate, but votes that are lawfully conducted throughout the 50 states. And we need to do all that we can to be vigilant of that. We need to make certain that when it comes to sororities and fraternities and civic organization, that we're out there on the ground, active and engaged each and every day, each and every week, building momentum, getting people to understand that what we have today is particularly at risk. And particularly with the conservative Supreme Court in place, they won't be great champions of voting rights. We're going to have to depend upon our state court system to protect them vigorously. We can't depend upon the federal courts any longer in terms of cases getting into the Supreme Court. So yes, a day of action, a day of organizing, a day of strategizing, a day of carrying on that legacy that was been articulated by Dr. King and others from that great civil rights movement back in the 60s. That's what it should be about. That's what we should be doing, not just providing 6 hours of 8 hours of service in one day, but working strategically to build a political infrastructure, getting people registered to vote, making certain in state with their voter IDs that people have them, and that we are ready and prepared to turn out in mass when election day comes, not just in 2022, but each and every year.
Okay, Senator, thank you. Mark Lee is here, but I'm going to ask you one last question. I think you did such a great job summing it all up. The bottom line is you do believe that we can do more. Our democracy is in danger. I remind everybody that it's also in danger not of only the voting rights and absentee ballots and early voting and all that, but also the outcomes of elections and the fact that the democracy of America is picking the results of our elections when they've already been done. But that, I think the Senator agrees with that. My question is, what is the dream? What do you want others around the country and the world to learn about the dream? Governor Youngkin, the new governor of Virginia yesterday, said that he does not believe the critical race theory should be taught at all, and that we just are all on an equal playing field. But do you believe that that is something that we need to address in terms of the fact that we got to keep fighting for the dream? And what does it mean? What should we all get from the dream today in the year 2022?
Well, I mean, I think Dr. King very articulately stated that he wanted people judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. When it comes to race, we should be mindful of race. We should be respectful of each other's cultural differences. We should understand that we are each unique and contribute a certain richness to our society. We are a multiracial society, a multi-ethnic society. So I think that is very important. But our color of our skin and our race and our ethnic heritage should not be a basis for us being evaluated as contributing citizens in society. And it shouldn't be held against people of color. Now, when it comes to critical race theory, it's nothing but a wedge issue. It's a wedge issue to get certain people out the vote that they really believe will respond to that particular narrative. It's not, critical race theory is not even taught in public schools of Virginia and really in public schools between grade 1 through 12 in any state that I'm aware of. So I think what they don't want to occur is for teachers to talk about the idea of how we got to where we are, and to understand that race is a component of society, to understand that there is systemic racism that continues to exist to this day. And yes, there are concepts like white privilege that are associated with people who are lighter in color and are white, having privileges that other people do not have access to. It's a real phenomena. It needs to be discussed. It needs to be addressed. That's not critical race theory. It's just about having an open discussion about how you address systemic racism in this day, time, and era. Do we want to be a colorblind society? Absolutely. Do we need to get there? Yes. But does that mean we deny our race and our heritage of each and every group? No, that should be respected at all costs. We just can't allow race to be a basis for one group discriminating against another.
Thank you. Senator, do you have a few more minutes with us or do you have to run?
I have a few minutes, but I do have to join another program.
I know you've got other things
Mark
that you
Lee,
got to do.
Mark, do you have any insight? Well, we want to thank Floyd McKissick for being with us, but any parting questions you have for him? This has been really informative. We want to bring you back if that's okay, perhaps even as a political analyst, because we now are going to be going on the Roku TV network, and I'm going to be needing to bring in experts like you, and Jessica Holmes couldn't make it today, but we're going to bring her on and others. So we'd love to have you back. We know you're a busy man, but thank you.
Well, thank you
And
very much, and I always enjoy spending time with you, Steve, and it's great. And thank you for all of your contributions in Morrisville, but far beyond, all
Oh,
across the
thank
state
you,
of North
sir.
Carolina and throughout our country, and through your
Thank you.
broadcast efforts and your work and your research. And of course, Mark and I go back even longer than you and I, Steve. I've known him
yes,
since he was about 2 years old, so that really dates me.
yes, yeah. Like I said, we've known each
I
other
knew
for a
both of his
while,
So,
Floyd.
parents.
I know
any
each other
last
since we
minute
were.
questions?
Yeah,
Do you have any questions you want to ask Floyd? We got
yeah, I
a
did
couple.
have, and I know he's got time constraints and everything. But I said a couple of times on this show that I've been very much shocked by the fact that we've not made as much economic gains as I feel we should have ever since Dr. King's assassination. So I'd love to hear Floyd's thoughts about the wealth gap and what we can do to address that wealth gap. Because I mean, it's still
Yeah.
something that's very much prominent in our society, even in 2022. And I know that your dad was one of the, well, actually was the founder of Soul City, which was an effort to
Mhm.
try to attack that wealth gap and was using some of that set aside money in order to try to create that program way back in like I want to say that was when I was in high school. So that would have been like in the 70s and all of that. But definitely it was an effort that he did in that regard. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about what Dr. King and even your dad would think about this tremendous wealth gap that we have and that we exist in this day and time.
Well, the wealth gap is continuing to grow between the haves and the have-nots, and between people of color and those that are not people of color. And it needs to be addressed in a very serious and significant way. There's no reason to just ignore it. Access to capital is a critical problem. Should there be banks and resources set aside to address that? In my mind, there clearly should be. Are there opportunities for people of color who are entrepreneurs to have access to capital? There are very, very serious constraints, just as there is when it comes to access to mortgages. I mean, there's still issues and problems that exist today in terms of people of color not having the same access. So do we need to understand what those barriers are? I think it's critical. Do we need to think about entrepreneurship and programs that encourage entrepreneurship among people of color? I think it's critical. Should we have people that are involved with the major bank and lending institutions establishing programs to target that? I think it's critical, and it can be done, but it needs to be more than just thinking about what happened after the death of George Floyd. It's about putting together a program that's significant, that's long-standing, that contributes more than a couple of $1,000s or a couple of $1 million to make an institution feel good. It means establishing a program that's ongoing, that helps people of color get access to capital, where they can establish businesses, they can get involved in enterprises that will provide jobs and opportunities to everyone, and that will allow them to provide a greater opportunity to become a part of the American economic mainstream, and including home ownership, because that's one vehicle and tool that opens up, that provides not just opportunities to grow wealth for one family, but it can become intergenerational in terms of passing it on.
No, no doubt, no
Fantastic.
doubt.
Well,
And like I
this has
said,
been.
I know you
He's
got
got
to
to
get
go.
ready to go and everything, but if you could just really quickly, I know your dad was the founder of Soul City, and I know those that have been fortunate enough to see the movie or the documentaries are familiar with that initiative that he tried to put together and everything. But I would love to hear your perspective about that and just kind of like your thoughts about those kind of efforts and what he was trying to do with that effort when he launched that, since this is an international platform and a lot of people around the globe may not even know about the attempt to create a Soul City.
Sure. I mean, my father was developer of Soul City. It was, I mean, Soul City was one of 14 new communities started back in the basically the early 1970s. There were, people don't realize there were 14 new communities started in the Urban Growth and Communities Act in 1968. It was the only one established by an African American development company. All the other ones were larger white companies. We had a $14 million federal loan guarantee commitment. What that allowed us to do is to sell bonds on Wall Street, which we sold about $10 million of bonds to help finance that particular development effort, and acquired 3,600 acres of land in the process, built the largest regional water system in the state of North Carolina that's still functional and operative today, as well as a major county-wide high school over in Warren County. provided probably about 3/4 of the funding for that particular project, and many, many other things. The idea was about entrepreneurship, and yes, there were programs that were established. My dad and Para Mitchell, former congressman from out of Maryland, were very helpful in establishing what they call the 8A set-aside program, which was a program that allowed for government contracts to go to minority business persons that, and so, I mean, you're talking about set-asides, and typically it was about 10%. It wasn't a great number, but it opened the doorway and pathway of opportunities for many. I think those type of efforts were ahead of their time. We suffered because of racism that we confronted with Senator Jesse Helms asking for audits and investigation of the project. And eventually when they came back in terms of the audits investigation, there was no wrongdoing. There was nothing improper, but nevertheless, it provided a negative impact that was challenging to overcome. And there were difficult economic times as well back in the late 70s. So, Soul City did not survive in terms of being a successful community that everyone envisioned it to be. But the infrastructure that it built and the dream of that it established still remain very much alive today and very viable today if people could come into the leadership and take on those type of efforts. But it doesn't even have to be a Soul City. It can be similar types of efforts to encourage entrepreneurship, ownership, engagement, and to elevate and provide opportunities to many. I mean, people working with us included Harvey Gantt, who later went on to become mayor of Charlotte, Eva Clayton, who later went on to serve Congress from that particular congressional district. Valeria Lee, who went on to establish a radio station, WVSP, over in Warrington, and then went on to establish herself in philanthropy here in North Carolina in a very powerful and significant way. So, I mean, we have many people that I can point to that came through that effort who went on to provide great leadership. But those types of efforts and efforts centered on Black economic development, I think, are critical. I think one thing my dad observed from the civil rights movement, it's great to have the Civil Rights Act passed and no longer segregated restrooms or lunch counters or restaurants. But if you don't have the money to go in and utilize those facilities, then you got a bigger problem. So it was about political power. It was about economic power. And the economic piece we're still working on today, and we need to work on it. Do we have more African Americans who have greater prosperity? Yes. But the challenge is so many of them are still in entertainment, are there in sports. There are not enough of them in business. A few have broken through glass ceilings, but not nearly enough. And when it comes to breaking glass ceilings with larger white corporation, mainstream corporations, that's excellent. That's commendable. But how about Black ownership and Black stockholders in minority-owned businesses that whites can also own an interest in? That there's not enough of today and has not been in the past.
Well, we have been just honored to have you. You've gone over your time. Wonderful conversation. We'd love to bring you back on. Folks, we've been with the great former Senator Floyd McKissick, a great leader in North Carolina, a freedom fighter as well as part of the McKissick legacy. And we will continue to keep fighting, my friend, for the dream, for quality. And as Anita Gorman, the poet laureate, said, America is not a past that you inherit, but one that you step into and repair it. And we know that we can do our part with the Day of Action to continue to build on the great foundation of freedom and democracy and equality for all. Thank you, Floyd. Have a good MLK Day. Keep getting to work.
Thank you. Thank you. Have a great day.
Appreciate you, Floyd. Definitely appreciate you being on here. Floyd mentioned my mom and everything, and yes, definitely mom was the founder of VSP, which is Voices Serving People, at the same time that his dad was launching Soul City and all of that. She's actually got to have a eye surgery on tomorrow, if I'm remembering correctly. I think it's tomorrow, not on Wednesday and everything. But definitely she is considered one of those leaders along with Eva Clayton and others. So definitely it's always good when I see Floyd, even though Nick, he was teasing me because he's like, I had the thick beard on today. I was meaning to go see the barber over the weekend, but I'll see him on Wednesday. So my appointment was not quite where I wanted. So I wasn't looking as sharp as I would have preferred, and definitely as mom would have wanted me for a big time international and national figure as Mr. McKissick.
Yeah. Well, and that was a fascinating conversation. We're going to spend a few minutes talking about MLK Day today, and then we'll go to our kind of wrap up where we talk about different events around the world. But today there's been a lot of virtual events. I got to be honest with you, it's hard to get the energy level starting your day on your computer at 7 in the morning for the interfaith breakfast. If you're listening in North Carolina, you can go to trianglemokcommittee.com. There's a lot of events going on today virtually. There's Triangle on the Cheap. There's a couple of in-person events going on. But for both of you, and for those of you around the world, I would just like to know, where do you think we need to go today in America? Do you believe that the dream is something that's still attainable? And what are your just thoughts about this day? We'll start with Nick. You've been, the founder of this network. You're a little bit older than me. What are your, what are your thoughts about Dr. King?
I'm trying to stay away from the grave. I mean, the thing is, there's a very interesting book that was written. I didn't want to bring up during Floyd's talk, but I'll bring it up now. If you haven't read it, my son gave it to me. Here it is. It's called Cass: The Origins of Our Disconnect by Isabel Wilkerson. I don't know if you've seen this book yet. Okay. She's a Pulitzer Prize winner. I want to get her on our station. There she is. I got to get her on, Mark. Got to get her on. Another Pulitzer Prize winner.
Just send her. We'll get her on.
But let me tell you what she did. Okay. She writes a book and she calls it caste rather than racism. Okay. And even in the book, she explains why. It's because the caste system in India, Steve, where they have the untouchables, she went over there, is very similar to the caste system that they have in the United States. She's drawing this parallel. And also one of the issues that she brought up, which she highlighted, which is very interesting about the history of America in and of itself. Slavery has existed before America even was like born. In other words, before the United States became the United States of America, it was there for about 150 years. I mean, it's hard to fathom the amount of time that took place from the early 1600s to the late 1700s that slavery became institutionalized in the United States, and then went on for another 100 plus, almost another 100 years, maybe even more than 100 years. So what she was pointing out is that if you look at it in the United States, we're talking about several centuries. It's not like a decade phenomenon. It's a multi-century. And then when she was over to India, and frankly, I haven't been over there, so I don't understand. They had a caste system, or maybe they still do. I don't know. They range from the untouchables all the way up to the Brahmins or something like that. So she really makes a very good distinction between that. Now, the United States is trying to eliminate that whole type of distinction. In the meantime, okay, I finally got on China. By the way, I tried to send this over to China. We can continually get rejected over there. I can tell you that their thought process of the United States is totally different than how we view ourselves. Seriously, because I'm on the Chinese sites now, talking to the Chinese people. It's totally different. If you think there's this big division between us and them, you got to look at how China views us. China doesn't view us as anything but the great Satan. Okay. In other words, and they point out, I hate to say it, a real tough part of our history, the Vietnam War. In other words, the bombs in Laos, the bombs in Vietnam, et cetera. And, and I'm now defending America. I feel really weird. Okay. I'm trying to defend America and I'm trying to defend the Vietnam War. I'm having a hard time with it. In other words, if you look through the whole history, then of course China is wonderful, and America is not so wonderful.
When you got a billion people, you can be wonderful. But Nick, I got two things that I was getting ready to bring up to you, and everything that I think you'll find interesting. I know that wasn't an exact figure; I was just using it as a a statistic or amount out there. But they got tons of people, and all of that is the point that I was trying to make. But there are two institutions that people talk about constantly in American history and in American politics and everything. And both of them, ironically, are tied to the slave system and therefore probably tied to the caste system. as well, because a lot of people don't want to admit to this, but the prison industrial complex was actually based off of the overseers and other things that had to do with slavery. I mean, the modern day version of what we have as a penal system, which is probably why a larger portion of the African American population is in those prisons, in addition to the brown population as well, because definitely it was done intentionally. It was part of the way that the slavery system was set up and everything. And I mean, the prison system came out of the overseer system,
Right.
which is definitely part of slavery. And then the other thing that's happened, and I don't know, I may not make too many of my friends all that happy in corporate America, is that if we look at corporate America, and I know that you've got folks that are in that pension field and you've done some work with corporate America. Unfortunately, most of the corporations that I'm aware of, including some right here in North Carolina, are almost based on what I would call a plantation mentality, meaning that the executives are usually older white gentlemen, kind of looking like you, Nick, and everything. Not trying to pick on you and everything, but they do look more like you than anybody else on this panel and everything. And most of the people in the middle management, like the secretarial jobs, there's quite a few of those that are women, and definitely African American women are included in that. And if you want to go down to the lower end jobs, I had one of those jobs way back in the late 80s, I believe it was, maybe the early 90s. But like we're talking about the mail room, shipping and receiving, the food service industries, the janitorial service, looks like a lot of brown and black folks and everything.
Yeah.
That sounds almost like a plantation to me and everything. And that's many of our corporations in America.
Yeah, right. And, frankly, the more things change, Mark, the more they remain the same.
Right.
And the thing is, if you do look at that corporate America, and the thing that really bothers me about this whole situation is that, okay, we're looking at this to me is a horrible statistic. 70% of the U.S. can't get a hold of $1,000. We got a real problem here. And then the other thing that bothers me is the Wall Street Journal. Okay, for those who get the Wall Street Journal, WSJ. All right, let me tell you, Friday, they have their mansion section in the Wall Street Journal. Okay. In other words, Mark, what it is,
they're gonna show me things I can't have. Nice of them.
Exactly. But it's not only that, it's just opulent wealth on steroids, literally. In other words, they buy $30 million homes, $119 million homes. Okay. They're buying all these unbelievably expensive homes, mansions. And you know how they're buying it? It's basically on the backs of the people you just discussed.
Yeah, no, it's on the backs of people like that.
In other words, all these people that are working for them, they're able to afford what do they spend it on? Do they enrich the people that they're working with? No, they take, it's corporate greed to excess. And we have that throughout the U.S.
Nick, we celebrate that though. I remember there used to be a show that was on television. I think it was I forgot the name of the show, but it would show like the homes of the wealthy, and it would go around literally showing
lifestyles of the rich and famous.
Thank you, lifestyles of the rich and famous. I knew that I was trying to remember the title of it, and I couldn't think of it. But lifestyles of the rich and famous. There's shows like these shows of the Boston house, the Atlanta housewives, and these other folks that are involved. Some of them in the African American community, but they're still involved in the wealth community, and it's basically highlighting the greed and the excess of our society. I guess is the best way to put it.
Well, I'm gonna pick on. Here's a guy I want to pick on today. He's the pick on billionaire of the day. Okay, remember there's only 1,600 billionaires in the world, so aren't that many. He's one of them, Jerry Jones. Okay, the story is he's a self-made oil magnate. Right. Okay, that's the lie, the big lie. Here's the reality. His father actually owned a insurance company that went from 400,000 to 6 million in capital in the 1960s. And the guy started off with basically $6 million, Mark. Okay. If you gave somebody $6 million other than Donald Trump, they're going to be very successful financially. And this is a big problem. And of course, I've argued that on the other side, and here's the pushback I get. Well, what do you want to do? Steal it from them? You want to tax them and take it from them? They're entitled to it. They earned it. In other words, there's a bunch of stuff that goes on. They earned it type of language comes back.
Well, I think that, and I think that this is a wonderful conversations we're having. And, I think that the fact of the matter is that, when we're talking about a day of action, right? I mean, these things occur for so long, and I think we need to bring awareness of it. Number one, and I mean, look, Glenn Youngkin, the governor of Virginia, I agree with the governor in that we don't want to go into every conversation assuming that a white American that we're talking to is a racist, but I
Yeah.
think we also need to make sure that we're comfortable having a conversation that race has been a factor and depriving people of economic opportunity, political opportunity, the rights to vote, and these are all
And
parts
and
of American history, and we shouldn't be hiding from it, right?
also there's this thing that really important that the previous speaker Floyd brought up. It's access to capital.
Right.
Everybody they don't understand how important it is to have access to capital. Once you have access to capital, your entire world changes. And I'll just give you an example. I have a client worth $100 million. He earns 10% on his investments, so he makes 10 million a year, and his lifestyle may have to spend a couple $100,000. Okay, so he gets to reinvest another $9 million every year. Then I got another client who's worth $1 million. He earns 10%. He earns 100,000. He spends it all on lifestyle. He goes nowhere. I mean, what happens is, and this is the reality of capitalism. It's a math game. As you increase your net worth, you can exponentially increase your net worth with very little drag on that. And so, yeah,
Education and savings. You know, one thing, yeah, exactly. You know,
well,
and
you can't
yeah,
win. You can't win. It's like a monopoly game. You can't win. The rich
but
people get richer, and the poor people go nowhere. And that's because that's just how capitalism is designed.
and
You
Mark,
know.
I want to ask you a question as we spend a few more days. But I want to end with what Dr. King's legacy and dream means to you as a black man, a businessman in Durham, a radio personality. But the point we're trying to make, we've talked a lot about voting rights, but one thing that I think I failed to do is to talk even this week in my newsletter about what Nick has talked about: access to capital, home ownership. Let's not forget that only 45% of black Americans owns home compared to 85% of white Americans. A high percentage of African and black men incarcerated in our prisons. uh, you know, and we're seeing these issues occur. And so I think a lot of this and the bias of the media, unfortunately, whenever you turn the news on and you see a criminal on TV, a lot of times they'll show that image of a black person in a hoodie, not every time, but a lot. And the mindset goes, well, they're poor, they're in crime, right? I mean,
Right.
do you believe that those stigmas have created a situation of systemic bias, that some people may not be racist, but they just see, how many times have we heard others say, I don't want to move into a neighborhood because it's a black neighborhood? I've heard that from many people during my lifetime, right?
Yeah,
And
but I mean, part of what I think happens is that it's part of it is come and pick on somebody that Nick will be glad that I'm picking on, which is our media. Because unfortunately, the media, if it presents that image all the time, if you've got the coverage of a crime and the crimes that are being covered are being that of those in the minority community, then yes, folks in the middle class neighborhoods will have that attitude. But I can guarantee you that and I don't have like exact statistics in front of me, but I think that I read several where that many of the drugs of America are actually in middle class America, and they're being consumed by there, but they're not necessarily being prosecuted in those neighborhoods. I know that definitely the opioid crisis, a lot of that was in the middle class neighborhood, whereas crack was mostly in the minority community. Look at the way that those have been handled differently and all of that. So that is kind of part of the problem that exists in the way that media covers things as well. But that's just some of my quick thoughts on that and everything. I don't know if Nick wants to counter me or if he agrees with me.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, that's definitely how the media distorts this, but also it's our criminal justice system distorts it because of they push toward this war on drugs type of stuff. And a lot of the people that sit in prisons today, well, what'd you do? I sold somebody some drugs, and all of a sudden they're in prison for a long, long time. And we have a whole project to get these people out, because some of them sit there for years in the prison system, and they're felonies. What they do? Well, they smoked weed or something like that, or they sold marijuana, and it still exists even today. It's a real really, it's a crime on society to have this war on drugs, which was populated by a lady I believe it was Nancy Reagan, was like into this, that this was going to be the solution. And it's not. It's a really a bad program. But what happens is then it affects all the family members that exist also as well. And even today, as we speak, there is still a federal felony or charge at the federal level if you are caught with marijuana. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And see, there are things like that that are in our legal system that should have been expunged decades ago, which are still there. And some of the stuff it's just got you got to change.
Well,
The
I think,
the entrepreneurship and home ownership of the Black economic development. See, these are important issues, entrepreneurship. But again, the kids aren't even getting taught that stuff. So how do they become entrepreneurs when they're not even taught about entrepreneurship? You go look at home ownership. I mean, there's no classes, and this is why I fault the education system. There's no classes on today. The house is one of your largest economic investments you're going to make during your entire lifetime, and there's no mandatory classes on acquiring a home. I mean, it's ridiculous. So we actually have a failing education system in the United States, and it doesn't serve anyone, in my opinion, to take a class in Latin and not take a class in home ownership. I mean, seriously, because it affects everything that you do. The interest rate, how do you acquire the house? How does it appreciate over time? What does the deed look like? What are the covenants of your association? I mean, it just goes on and on. How do you raise the capital even to buy a home today? They made it out of reach for most people because when inflation hit, it just pushed up the values of homes. And I talk to people all the time. Well, do you own your home or not? Well, I rented it.
well, absolutely. Well, real quickly, before we get off this theme of Dr. King, Mark, what are your thoughts about the dream today? A lot of work to do, and then I want to close out with some thoughts as we get to other. My monologue today will be at my close about Dr. King. But what are your thoughts today? Growing up, you've watched this, and been inspired by this man. You've talked about the dream, and here we are. What are your thoughts?
I mean, we still have a long way to go, but I mean, part of it is just kind of continuing the dialogue that we're having here on this program, as well as continuing dialogues out there, but also actually doing kind of what the King family was saying, which is actually, putting not just giving lip service, and that's across the board, not just for any one ethnic group or any one part of society, but all of society actually try to live in a way that we're actually honoring his legacy and not just kind of giving it lip service. I mean, I've heard some people that are even on the very conservative side that will say that they admire the man and admire what he was all about, but then will also turn around and do programs that are totally the antithesis of what he was about. They were totally against what he was about and things along those lines. So I think part of it is holding people accountable, but also making sure that we're actually honoring what that legacy was. I mean, I know that part of the speech is that he's hoping that there'll be a day that his children and the children of other ethnic groups can hold hands and really be worried more about the content of the character and not necessarily the color or the ethnicity, or I would even argue the orientation or the gender or a number of other things that are out there in that regards. And I still think that it is achievable, even in this day and time, even with the divisions that are going on, even around other issues that are happening, whether that's Roe versus Wade, whether that's the vaccines or a number of other things that are out there that are divisive points. But I do think that the dream is alive and the dream can still be achieved. It's just a matter of us getting our thoughts together and actually achieving that dream.
And thank you. And for those of you listening, we're gonna close out with Dr. King. There's one thing you can do if you're in the U.S. listening to the show. They're acknowledging Day of Service. So Activate Good is one website where you can go to find the nonprofit that you'd like to go contribute. You can get in touch with them. There's also the AmeriCorps. All of these things are the Day of Service. My challenge as the host of the show is to make it a day of action, not only today, but every day. What can we do to educate those neighbors around us that may disagree with us on these issues of working together as Americans to move forward in progress? And make a phone call to your Congress leaders, your senators. If you're concerned about democracy, if you're concerned about having a republic where your outcomes of your elections are honored, and if we're willing to listen to you on this Pod TV show on World Edition to have a conversation of how we can get to that place where we can be, aware that we have differences, but that we're judged on the content of her character. A dream that, like Mark Lee said, needs a lot of work. But we'll be coming back to that at the close today as I close out on the special MLK edition. With that being said, real quickly, Novak Djokovic is on a plane flight back home to Serbia. He is being denied now playing the Australian Open for probably the next 3 years, although Australia said that that could change. Thought the record would be broken? Guess not. Nick, your thoughts?
Well, I'm on the websites also discussing this with our friends in Serbia and our mates in Australia. Here's how the Aussies look at it. I think the rest of the world look at it. Who does this guy think he is? The best human being in the planet, and the Serbians superior to everybody else. Okay, here's how the Serbians view the Joker. He is the best human being on the planet, and the Serbs are superior to everybody else. Okay, and then they start attacking the United States. They're going, look at the U.S. how bad we are. We have all these problems with racism. We have civil wars. We kill people in Vietnam. Look at all the problems U.S. ignoring the Bosnian genocides that existed for years that they don't want to discuss. I mean, come on. If you want to look at genocide, go to Bosnia-Herzegovina and the Serbian area. And they don't want to hear that. In other words, they try to push make America bad. They're going going after the Australians. Now, I didn't know that, but apparently they were Aborigines. Years ago, the Australians hunted them down and they were killing them. I didn't know that, So they did put out a very valid point. They don't want to hear Shaquille when he ever decides to get back on, defend the great continent of Australia, when for years they were, at least according to Wikipedia, they were killing the Aborigines. So they were basically, the Serbs were attacking Australia, excuse me, and saying how great and wonderful the Joker is. He's the most superior human being on the planet. Now, last time I heard that, there was a guy in Germany who was saying that stuff, So it's just very interesting to see how the Joker. Now, I'd deport the guy. I mean, I don't see where this guy's better than everybody else. They think he is. I don't think he is. So I'm not making friends in Serbia. That's all I can tell you.
The Australian Open is on now, so you can watch it. The other sports theme, and before we get into some international and national issues, yesterday was a tough night. Steelers lost, my home team. I want to give a shout out to Ben Roethlisberger. He celebrated 20 years of a wonderful career in the Pittsburgh Steelers. He won 2 Super Bowls. And the town manager of Mooresville and I are both Steelers fans. So I want to get a hamburger named in honor of Ben called the Roethlisberger. So I'm going over to Big Daddy Burger Bar today, or a burger joint, because I want to have some place. I heard they have one in Pittsburgh.
I was going to say, you probably have to do that in Pittsburgh.
But I tell you what, he had a great career and 2 Super Bowls. He was a great leader for the Steelers. Tough. And I tell you, I have just been impressed with the NFL this season. I mean, look, there's a lot of teams out there. Brady looking strong, the Packers, the Rams. You've got the Bengals, you got the Bills. I tell you, this is going to be whoever holds that Super Bowl trophy, Vince Lombardi trophy, is. It's game on, guys, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, just
for years I hated Tom Brady. I mean, he was the worst. He was the pit. But I'm from Tampa. So he went to Tampa. Now I love Tom Brady. He's the greatest. He's the one. All of a sudden the allegiance changed. So if Djokovic was to move to the United States, I might say, he's the greatest person in the world now. I might change my opinion.
Real quick, the last point I'll make about football, and then we'll move on. And if you guys want to throw something in there, but one of the reasons Tom Brady is so hard to play against is only 2.1 seconds from the snap to the throw. And it's just very hard for any defense to manage that. So as this guy continues to win games, when he gets to that playoff game, you cannot count him out for a Super Bowl. I mean, think about that. You're going against the guy that can snap. I was watching him yesterday, and, I could literally count. There's not that many quarterbacks in the NFL. They're great quarterbacks that can pass the ball within 2 seconds of getting the snap. And so the more this guy stays in the game, I tell you, he can win another one. I mean, he's definitely dangerous.
How long is he going to be dangerous? He's like 44. He'll be 45 next
I
year.
don't think it's slowing him down. I think it's his mindset, his work ethic. So, Mark Lee, any thoughts about Rattlisberger as well?
Well, the one thing I was going to add about Roethlisberger is that he is definitely an amazing individual and definitely does some great things in the sense of being a great player. And, I definitely admire him. I think that he is a great player and I thoroughly enjoy what he's all about and everything. But I really wish that I'm just glad on one side that we did have somebody that lost and somebody that I'm glad that it's lost. And that is none other than that whole New England franchise. So I was not crying about them losing or anything along those lines because they definitely could go ahead and lose, and I would have no problem with that whatsoever in the least bit. So I was glad that they went ahead and took that L. So that means we don't have to worry about New England. Now we just got to worry about Tom Brady. And there's some other tremendous teams. I think that Raiders-Bengals game was a great game, and I did watch some of the other games, even though I didn't watch as much as I was hoping to because I had some other engagements and things that I was involved with. But I'm going to definitely try to catch it. I love the playoffs. I love college football and definitely love the NFL. My fantasy football team did horrible as usual, so that was not a good thing, but hopefully they'll get better and all of that. But that's some of my thoughts around sports. I have been following the tennis as well. So that's just some of my immediate thoughts in that regard.
And we
Hey,
will be.
I did learn something that you'll be fascinated by. Apparently, because we had a new show on the network, Raven Thistle Live, and I did not realize that microwaves are banned apparently in parts of the Asian culture. I think it might be Japan and one of the Russian cultures. I was going to ask Sasha about that because apparently there's some health issues that they put out about the microwaves, and they say that they're not good for us at all.
That's interesting. Yeah. Well, I try to always stay away from the microwave. Not about the radiation coming in. I always did that. But that's interesting. Interesting fact. So real quickly, I'm just going to go through a couple of things around the world. First of all, there's been a talk about the United States bracing for staff shortages in the healthcare system because of the Supreme Court's critical decision on vaccine mandates. The ruling will uphold the Biden administration's requirement for millions of healthcare workers to be vaccinated against COVID, could wedge workers between opposing state and federal policies. So, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens with whether we have enough healthcare workers. We talked about Djokovic. There has been a volcano erupted in Tonga. They said that could be a warning of a tsunami, even as close as the West Coast. We'll be watching that. And the final thing I'll say before a shout out to our Jewish community, the voting rights look like they're really in trouble right now with the filibuster, not being abandoned by Sinema and Manchin. And now the Democrats are going to have a tough fight for challenging many of these state laws that are going in. And meanwhile, Donald Trump, the former president, had a huge rally in Arizona, looking more and more like he is going to make a push to run for the White House, could have a rematch. And as we get ready for closeout, we'll talk about some of these issues. We do want to give a word of prayer to the Jewish communities of the United States and around the world for the terrible situation in Texas, where there was hostages taken. I think the situation is still going on. And we know that there's many synagogues where we live, Mark and I live, but we just want to let the Jewish community know that our thoughts and prayers are with them. We know they've been subject to a lot of anti-Semitism, a lot of hate, and a lot of attacks. We value their contributions to our country, and wherever you are, if you're a member of the Jewish faith, we value your contributions to the world. And we pray on this day where we honor Dr. King, that we also do not hate or discriminate against any religion or faith. So I wanted to just make sure we got that in today on World Edition. Mark, any thoughts?
No, I definitely agree, and we need to be honoring our folks on a regular basis and everything. We're actually at about the time for you to give your 5-minute close and everything. But definitely, I know a lot of folks will be honoring Dr. King and his legacy during the day. There'll be definitely there are marches going on, there are dinners, there are a number of other things. I just want folks to reflect on his life and actually try to find ways that they can honor him during this day and time, and do it in a very positive and wonderful way. That would be one of the thoughts that I would add, is that we need to find ways to honor his legacy and to continue that legacy going on.
Well, thank you so much, Mark. And now it's for my final take, which I practiced a little bit. It's a little longer than usual. I sort of weeded into some comments I gave a few weeks ago. But during this pandemic, I've had the honor of watching with my wife and my son many of the Marvel's movies on the Avengers, many of the Disney movies of streaming Star Wars. Looking forward to the new series Kenobi and Boba Fett, which we're going to watch together as a family this weekend. But, what I want to make sure we talk about today as we close out the show is that I think many of us are drawn to the Avengers or the Jedi and the Star Wars series because we want to feel safe. We want to feel safe at a very divisive and polarizing time that somebody has special powers, whether they're an Avenger superhero or a Jedi that can make stuff move and can do mind tricks and can continue to focus on keeping order and peace in the George Lucas galaxy. But on this day, I want us to forget the Marvel's movies, forget the Disney streaming Star Wars, and know and realize that throughout the history of mankind, there have been such heroes who have lived among us. Today we celebrate one, the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. But he's been joined the ranks, I call them the moral Jedi or the Avengers, of Gandhi, of Thurgood Marshall, of Rosa Parks, of Mandela, of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, of Mandela. And what they all have in common is that during the darkest times in our history, when their backs were against the wall, they brought hope to the world. They changed their communities because they were willing to get uncomfortable and take on causes that were not popular at the time. We often honor these leaders, and today Dr. King, that they were lifelike heroes, larger than life heroes who did remarkable things because they were popular or accepted. But it was actually the opposite. They had to fight against oppression and injustice. Their marches to freedom were marathons, not sprints. At each mile marker, they experienced ridicule, embarrassment, imprisonment, but they never lost sight of a finish line. Sometimes a finish line that they would not even see in their lifetime. That finish line was freedom and equality and democracy. Today, we celebrate equality for all Americans, regardless of racial discrimination, bias, faith, sexual orientation, gender, that we could sit together at the table of brotherhood. Today, we must realize that these extraordinary heroes, when you look at it, changed the world. We had a free India. We had a free South Africa. We had the largest civil rights movement in the history of the world. We had the desegregation of our nation. We saw President Johnson sign in the history of this country voting rights legislation and civil rights legislation. And we saw in the course of our history many, many great firsts, like Katherine Johnson, who brought John Glenn back from the heavens, or Sidney Poitier, who we lost this year, who was the first Black man to win the Oscar. We saw Thurgood Marshall become a Supreme Court justice after he argued Brown versus Board of Education. We saw Colin Powell become the first Black Secretary of State and Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, followed on by Condoleezza Rice, who would serve as Secretary of State, and the 44th President of the United States, Barack Obama, who became the first Black president. Today, we see Lloyd Austin serve as the first Secretary of Defense. We have come so far in America, but yet we have so much more work to do. Let us never forget on this MLK Day that positive change comes from ordinary citizens who are willing to do extraordinary things, who are willing to get uncomfortable and to run up a hill, perspiring, tired, fatigued, but never giving up. With each explosive step forward, they march forward. They give us hope. They give us opportunity. As in the words of Freddie Mercury in one of my favorite songs, the show must go on, and it will go on. Let us remember the dream today. The dream will never die. Let's keep fighting. Thank you all so much for being with me today. Make it a day of action, in addition to making it a day of service. And wherever you are on the world, from our family to yours, we wish you a remarkable day, a remarkable MLK Day. Get uncomfortable. Get to work. Thank you. See you tomorrow.